Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be finishing up a review of the LEOBOG K81. Now, as I said in my unboxing and first impressions video, this is my first time reviewing a keyboard, so there was a lot for me to learn in terms of the tech that goes into keyboards because it's my first experience with a more premium keyboard. So I appreciate everyone's patience with me figuring out the lingo and all that kind of stuff for me to finish up this review. So thank you very much. I do apologize in advance if I miss anything important about this board. Again, not too familiar with the tech, so if I'm missing something super important, be sure to let me know down in the comments, but I'm pretty sure I covered everything that's on the K81 here. Now, before we get started with the full review, I just wanted to shout out LEOBOG again, who is kind enough to send the K81 out for me to review, so thank you very much to them. I'm very grateful to have a nice premium board to use as a comparison for future keyboard videos, and also this keyboard is also quite nice, and I really do enjoy typing on it. As always, reviews in this channel will be unbiased, regardless of a free or discounted unit. I'm always going to tell you the truth about a product covered here on the channel. And as always, this video will be fully subtitled, and I will have timestamps down in the description if you're looking for a particular topic about the K81. Alrighty, let's first talk about the typing experience that's here on the K81, and then we'll talk about the rest of the features of this board. Now, in terms of the typing experience, the LEOBOG K81 is using their ice crystal linear switches. Now, these switches are linear switches that have an actuation weight of around 35 plus minus grams. Now, these switches at first did feel a little heavy to me. I'm coming from the HyperX Cherry Reds that were a very, very light gaming optimized switch. So at first, these switches did feel quite heavy, and it did take me a little while to get used to them. For the first week or two, just because I wasn't used to the heavier switches, I did have issues with fatigue over long-term use, but once I got used to switches, I really actually did end up liking them quite a bit. The key switches themselves have a very creamy, thonky sound to them due to the gasket mounting and the PET foam inside the case here. The sound dampening and force dampening is really well done here on the K81. All the keys are extremely well stabilized across the entire K81. It is just a really nice board to type on. Now, this is where I primarily like the K81 the most, because I just liked it for typing and scripting and that kind of stuff for work. It was just a very pleasant board to type on that had a really nice feedback to it just from the creamy thunkiness of the keys. So overall, the K81 was a really fantastic board to type on. When it comes to the gaming use case, it was a little different. Now, when it comes to the gaming performance, this is what LEOBOG is advertising the K81 as, because they're advertising this as a very aesthetic RGB filled gaming keyboard. And while it does work for gaming, for me, the typing experience kind of outshined the gaming experience on the K81. Now, that's not to say the K81 isn't a good gaming keyboard. The board performs well. The problem is that the ice crystal linear switches that are on the K81 are a little on the heavy side for gaming use cases, and with gaming, speed is crucial and heavy switches aren't ideal. On top of that, for me personally, I didn't like that the lack of actuation on these linear switches kind of didn't really give me a feedback point, so it was very difficult to do things like counter strafe and that kind of stuff in game. It just made the overall gaming experience not that great, unfortunately. Now, obviously, this is primarily due to these switches. There's nothing wrong with the board itself. It's more of just the switch type that was on the board. Now, the K81 is a hot swappable board, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get some other lighter, more tactile switches for the K81. I'm going to try them on there because, again, the gaming performance was still fine. It just was kind of hampered by the linear switches that are a little heavy, so I'm going to try out some new switch types. Now, I did notice that on LEOBOG's website, there is a new option for the default switches on the K81 that was not there before. Instead of the ice crystal linear switches, there are these ice soul tactile switches that you can get by default on the K81. Those sound a lot better for gaming use case. I don't know what the specs of that switch is, unfortunately, because they're not on LEOBOG's website anywhere, but I'm assuming the tactile ones are going to be a lot better for gaming. The linears are going to feel a lot better for just general use and that kind of stuff. Now, as I mentioned before, the K81 is a hot swap board, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get myself some other switches to do some testing on this board. So if there's a particular switch you want me to take a look at that may be better for gaming use case, let me know down in the comments and I'll see if I can get my hands on those and test them on the K81 in the future. All right, now I wanted to mention one thing before we go on, since we're talking about gaming performance. Now, the K81 does have an option in the software for sensitivity. It also does have debounce settings and that kind of stuff, but the sensitivity one is the one that really caught my eye. Now, this isn't going to be a rapid trigger-esque kind of a thing. I believe this is just something to adjust the sensitivity on the switches. However, for my switches, the ice crystal linear switches that came with my K81, it didn't do anything. I'm assuming either you need a specific kind of switch for this to work. Maybe there's going to be a special type that LEOBOG will release in the future, or it just didn't work in the software because I had a beta version of the software when I did this review. So I'm not sure what that sensitivity option really does. I didn't really notice it to be doing anything, but that may be different down the road. So there is an option to adjust some of the sensitivity, but just keep in mind it's not going to be like a rapid trigger kind of change of a sensitivity. It's going to be a little different. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about ergonomics. Now, the K81 is a very forward tilted board by default. You can tilt the board even more if you want to by using the extra feet to cover the feet towards the rear of the board. However, the problem with that is that the board is so high, it is kind of awkward to type on. Now you can balance the board out by using those extra feet that I mentioned before and put them over the front skates on the K81, kind of like suction cups, and just kind of stick them to the bottom, which does work. It does make the board feel balanced. The only problem is that the feet come off pretty easily because they lose their suction over time, and if you move the board they come off right away. On top of that, it makes the entire board very high, so much so where it's very awkward to type on it. Now I was able to kind of go around this by using a wrist rest. The K81 does not have a wrist rest by default, but that was the easiest way to fix this. Now, as someone who came from a flat keyboard, I would have much rather seen LEOBOG have this board be flat out of the box than have some kind of way you could like screw in a little pin on the bottom to adjust the height instead of it being such a forward tilted board. Again, I will say over time I did get used to it. I didn't need the wrist rest as much. Now I will mention here, you can remove the stock feet on the bottom of the K81. The only problem with that though is that then the board just slips all over your desk because there's nothing holding it on. Now you could put on grip tape on the bottom of the board or something to hold it onto your desk, but it would have been much better to see LEOBOG either include some kind of wrist rest in the box or have just a different way of tilting the board so people can make it flat if they want, or if they make it more tilted, just because it's a little aggressively tilted for my tastes. But again, that's based off my opinion coming from a flat board. If you are someone who's using more premium boards that are often tilted forwards, this may not bother you so much. Alrighty, now I also wanted to talk about the keyboard QC. Oh, we've been joined by Merlin. All right, hold on. Merlin has joined us for this section. Hello, Merlin. You're going to talk about keyboard QC with me? All right, cool. Now, the overall build quality on the K81 is extremely solid. The QC is very good. I haven't had any issues over my testing period. The keys stayed well stabilized. The only thing I really noticed that was kind of awkward is that sometimes the edge of the board can sink into the shell a little bit due to the mounting mechanism. Now, you have to put an insane amount of pressure onto the board for this to happen, but it would be nice to see potentially just something in the corner to maybe keep it a little more stable with its gasket mounting, but it's a very minimal issue. Now, one other thing I did want to talk about the QC is the QC sticker itself. Now, on the clear versions of the K81, which is the mint, salt, the pink bunny, and the Morse code versions, you can see a QC sticker underneath the spacebar here. Now, to be totally honest, I'm actually a really big fan of QC stickers. I really do think a lot more companies should be implementing QC stickers as just a way to tell the user, hey, this has been QC'd properly. The only problem with this is that you can see the QC sticker very clearly with these clear keycaps, and it's kind of an eyesore. Now, of course, you can remove the QC sticker, but then you have to take apart the board to do so. It would be nice to see LEOBOG maybe move the QC sticker somewhere else just so it's not so jarring. On other versions of the K81, like the coffee and the space one, that's not going to be a problem because the keys aren't transparent, but on the transparent versions, it's a bit of an eyesore. So that is something that would be nice to see on future versions of the K81. Just having this QC sticker somewhere else so it's not a bit of an eyesore would be nice to see. All right, now I wanted to briefly talk about the keycaps here on the K81 because I did make a mistake of what I thought these were initially. So initially I thought these keycaps, the lettering on the keycaps were going to be stickers, but it turns out these are actually pieces of plastic that are mounted into the top of these shine through keycaps. Now there is also a little bit of grittiness on the top of these stickers. They kind of have like a very fine grit sandpaper feel to them, which is actually quite nice because it helps you anchor your fingers on the keycaps themselves. I didn't have any issues where the keycaps kind of felt slippery over long-term use. The keycaps stayed very consistent, which is great to see. I just wanted to mention it because some of the keycaps, the lettering is slightly crooked. Again, very much splitting hairs here, but that's why I initially thought it was a sticker, but they're actually pieces of plastic that's mounted into the top of the keycaps. So these keycaps are really nice quality. They feel fantastic. The only problem with them is how they work with the RGB on the K81. So let's talk about that next. All right, now the RGB on the K81 is very, what's a good word for this? Very apparent. There's very obvious that K81 kind of advertised this as a very RGB aesthetically focused keyboard here on the K81. And to their credit, the RGB is gorgeous. I really actually do like the RGB on this board, and I'm someone who doesn't really like RGB, but the RGB implementation on this board is beautiful. There's a bunch of different modes by default on the board. There's per key lighting. The whole thing is just gorgeous to look at. It's a very eye-catching keyboard, which I think is kind of what LEOBOG went with this because it's kind of that aesthetic kind of a thing, but it does look gorgeous, especially with these shine through keycaps on my Mint Salt Edition. The only problem with the RGB is that the RGB is so bright, and these are shine through keycaps, it can actually make it kind of difficult to actually see the lettering on the caps. Now this was a little frustrating for me because I haven't used a 75% board before, so I was learning a new layout, and I did have to kind of look and type at what I was doing. And with the RGB on full blast, it's so bright and it shines through these clear keycaps so much, you basically can't see the lettering on the top of the boards. And and because the lettering is this piece of plastic that's mounted into the top of the keycap itself, it's not shine through, so the light doesn't go through the top of the keycap, it goes around it, which makes it very difficult to see under some circumstances. Now obviously this issue went away over time as I got used to the layout, but for learning layout it was kind of frustrating. I definitely would have preferred to see maybe more of like a pudding keycap like the SteelSeries set I have here on my HyperX Alloy Origins core, because you can see the lettering on the keyboard through with the RGB, and then also the pudding keycaps do kind of diffuse the light a little bit. Don't get me wrong, the clear ones look gorgeous, it is a beautiful looking board, but from a utility kind of standpoint it definitely does hinder it a little bit. Now I did end up just turning off the RGB just so I could learn the layout, which was fine, and again this is a very minimal thing. I'm very much against splitting hairs here, but maybe having some see-through keycaps in the future where you can see the lettering through, or the light can kind of go through the top of the keycap, would be nice to see here on the K81. Alrighty, now let's talk about connectivity. Now as I mentioned in my unboxing video, the K81 is a tri-connectivity board that supports USB-C, Bluetooth, and 2.4 GHz wireless via the included USB-A dongle. Now I tested all the communication methods and they all worked perfectly fine. I used the wired version the most just because I prefer my keyboard to be wired, but I didn't have any issues with the Bluetooth or wireless connectivity. Now one really cool thing I did notice about the K81 is that when you turn the board on, the board will actually flash and let you know what connectivity type you're using, and it will tell you what kind of keyboard layout the keyboard is using. Either it'll be iOS, Android, Mac, or Windows, and there's all the different connectivity types as well, which is really cool to see. You can always hit the function key to show you what layouts you're using, which is a really cool feature. Now one problem I did note is that I couldn't figure out how to switch the keyboard layouts, because it says there's iOS, Mac, and Android on here, but I wasn't able to figure out a way to change it on the board itself, and since I was using a beta version of the software, I couldn't figure out how to do it on there either, unfortunately. So I'm sure there's a way to switch it on the board itself, but I haven't been able to figure out how to do so. If I do figure out how to switch it natively on the board, I'll be sure to make a comment down below and let you guys know about that. Now my only real issue with the connectivity on the K81 wasn't necessarily the connectivity itself, it's actually the connectivity switch on the back of the board. Now the switch is just this very oddly shaped plastic switch that is very hard to slide. The problem with it is that if I wanted to change the connectivity modes, if I was using it on multiple devices, like if I had it set on, let's say 2.4 GHz for my computer, and then I had Bluetooth on my phone, and I had wire connectivity for something else, in order to change the connectivity, it's really difficult for you to like reach over the board and actuate the slider just because where it's located, it's very awkward to do so. It would be nice to see LEOBOG maybe change this to a different, more grippy kind of switch or something, because what I end up having to do is just pick up the board and manually switch it constantly, which was kind of annoying. Very minimal. It is very much splitting hairs here because I have bigger hands, so this may not be an issue for everyone, but that was something to note. Again, I primarily use this on just one computer via USB-C, so it wasn't that big of a problem, but if you are someone who's using this board for multi-connectivity across multiple devices, this is something you may be worried about. Alright, now speaking of the software for the K81 was actually surprisingly hard to find because it wasn't on LEOBOG's website. I ended up finding it on another website where the K81 was being sold. Now I'm assuming by the time this video goes live, the software for the K81 will be available on LEOBOG's website, but I will say the software itself is fine. I don't really have too much experience in the software area for keyboards. The only really point of reference I have is the HyperX Ingenuity software for my Alloy Origins core, but compared to that, it was completely fine. The only problem I had with it that it was kind of hard to figure out how to do things with the board, because I couldn't like select the knob on the top of the board to rebind that to something else. It was just always stuck by default controlling volume and muting my PC, which is fine. I'm assuming that's going to be fixed in the newer version of the software, but again, my experience is off of a beta version, so just keep that in mind. By the time this video goes out, the software will most likely be a lot better, but my experience was fine on it. It's fine. It's just a little frustrating not be able to rebind specific keys, but again, it's just an older version of the software. I'm assuming all that's going to be fixed on the newer versions coming out. Now the K81 is using a massive 3000 milliamp hour battery, which thank God it is, because the RGB absolutely nukes the battery life on this thing, but I'll talk about that in a second. Now the problem with the battery is that the software, because it's a beta version, doesn't really show the battery life remaining on the unit, so it's very difficult for me to estimate the actual battery life. So just keep in mind what I say going forward is very much an estimate. Your use case may vary significantly, but this is just going off of my experience. I did all my testing here with the 2.4 GHz and the auto sleep off. Now of course turning auto sleep back on will extend your battery life a little bit, but for the sake of testing I just turned it off. Now with the RGB on full blast on rotating colorway, it lasted around 2 to 3 days of use, which is pretty surprising for a 3000 milliamp hour battery, but it's to be expected with the RGB. Now I will say with the RGB disabled and auto sleep off, the battery life on the K81 was significantly significantly better, more within the range of like 9 to 10 days, if not more. Again, I had auto sleep off. If you have auto sleep on, it's going to last even longer. So RGB is going to heavily impact your experience here on the K81. Again, if you're going to use the RGB, I would highly recommend using the auto sleep option to turn the keyboard off when you're not using it, just because it is going to drain your battery very, very, very fast. I'm assuming with auto sleep on and the RGB on full blast, you could probably stretch it more to like maybe 4 or 5 days, but it will depend on your use case. In my experience, having RGB off was the best and that had the best battery life overall. Alrighty, let's talk final thoughts. Now, just because I've had some issues with the software, I'm going to take that out of this in terms of final thoughts, because the software problems I have aren't going to be on newer versions of the K81, because the software will be up by the time this video goes out most likely. So I'm not really going to consider that with my review, which means that the only real problems I have with the K81 is that the board is a little too aggressively tilted towards the front by default, and there's no way to make the board flat, and the multi-connectivity switch on the back of the board is kind of hard to actuate, which are two relatively small problems in my opinion. You can just buy a wrist rest to negate the height of the board, and the multi-connectivity switch, again, if you're not using it for multi-connectivity use, it doesn't really matter that much. Most of the time I use the board plugged in anyways, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. So very much I'm kind of splitting hairs here, and again, things like I mentioned with the RGB being too bright and the keycaps not being shined through and the QC sticker being under the spacebar are very minimal things, which is funny because I'm looking at the K81 from a performance, very scrutinous reviewer's perspective, but Mrs. Mellon, who's looking at this keyboard from a shiny lights and good sound, loves this keyboard to death. Actually, funny enough, she keeps stealing the keyboard when I'm not using it because she likes it so much. So while the keyboard may not be for me, again, I do love the typing experience, but that's the only thing I really love about the board. Mrs. Mellon loves this keyboard. She loves this thing to death. So I think Mrs. Mellon's input here with her constantly stealing the K81 is going to kind of finalize what I think about this board. If you're looking for a very pleasant, creamy, thonky typing experience with great build quality and great user experience, I would highly recommend the K81. Again, I would recommend getting a wrist rest, but that's pretty minimal. It's like $20 off of Amazon. If you're looking for a performance board, I would recommend looking elsewhere and looking at LEOBOG's other options or other performance boards on the market. But from a user standpoint, the K81 is a fantastic board. Performance still needs to be worked on, but we'll see what LEOBOG has to offer with their K81 Pro coming out later this year, because I have a feeling that board is going to be a lot better in terms of the performance area. But anyways, that is going to be everything for my thoughts on the LEOBOG K81. Thank you very much again to LEOBOG for sending this out for me to take a look at. I greatly appreciate it. I'm sure Mrs. Mellon is going to be super happy now that she can steal my keyboard permanently. If you guys do want to learn more about the LEOBOG K81, I will have the product page linked down in the description for you to check out. I will also link the software from that other website in case it's still not on LEOBOG's website when this video goes up. So if you guys are having difficulty finding the software, I'll have that linked down to the bottom as well. But that is everything for today. Thank you very much again. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. I'll be doing a lot more keyboard reviews later in 2024, so stay tuned for more stuff like this. And thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.